let's take a look at these vector paths themselves and get a better understanding of how they work. So we already know that each of these paths have these anchor points and also have these control handles for the curves that are there. Now I'm actually going to open up this particular file here. It's called Fills and Strokes. And again, if you have access to the exercise files, you can find that in Chapter 1, Key Illustrator Concepts. I'm going to open up my layers here, and I'm going to turn off this path geometry because the reality is that even though that you have these anchor points here and these control handles, those don't show up on a printout. In fact, those are just there on your screen for you to be able to work with those particular paths and control how they're shaped. But I'm going to turn those off because you don't see those. Even though my screen looks like it's blank right now, I can go ahead and click and drag to select and see that these paths are still here. Have these exact paths are duplicated on another layer here called Path Appearance, and we'll talk more about layers and the way that you select them later, so don't get too worried about that. More important to focus here on the concepts that we're dealing with here. Now, paths themselves exist with all these anchor points and these control handles only on screens so that you can control them. However, when you print those paths, right now you will not see anything on a printout, and that's because these paths themselves have no appearance. So basically, a path itself is something that exists inside of a computer as far as where these anchor points are mathematically plotted on some kind of a graph. However, I need to be able to give these particular paths some kind of an appearance. I have to get them dressed. I have to put something on them so that I can see what they look like. Otherwise, they're invisible. They won't show up on a printout. My printout is going to look just like this. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select, let's say, just this rectangle down here on the bottom. And there are two kinds of attributes that vector graphics can have applied to them. Something called the fill attribute and something called the stroke attribute. Now, of course, it's important to realize that you can either add a fill and a stroke. You don't have to have both. You can have one or the other. You could have both of them. Some objects, for example, this particular path that I have over here, remember, it's an open path. It's not a closed path. So there's nothing that I could do to apply a fill. There's nothing to fill here. So I would only be able to apply a stroke attribute to a path like this. So I'm choosing here the rectangle on the bottom because I can apply both a fill and a stroke attribute. So one of the attributes that I can do is a fill. If I come up over here to my control panel, and again, we'll talk more about how this is used, I could choose, let's say, a color. For example, I will choose yellow for the fill. So again, this is kind of at the core of what a vector graphic is. Sometimes vector graphics are called object-based graphics. It means that I have a concept of a shape, which are defined by my anchor points. So right now I have 4 anchor points that define this particular shape. We call it a rectangle. That rectangle right now has an interior area, and that area is filled with, the fill attribute is with a yellow color. And I can very easily just click on this object and select it as a whole object and move that object around on my screen if I want to. Now, I also have the ability to add a stroke attribute. So right now, what I've done is I basically specified that this object right now, the anchor points that are on that object right now that have basically defined a path, the interior of that path should be filled with a color. I can also specify a stroke attribute. A stroke attribute will allow me to basically put paint or visualize the actual path itself. So right now, again, I know that there's a line that is connecting all these 4 anchor points. I can actually show that by applying a stroke attribute. And if I go over here, I will be able to maybe go ahead and try to apply a black stroke to this. So now visually, when I print this, I will see a yellow box with a black line around it. Now, there are different kinds of attributes that you could have, or different kind of settings that you can apply to each of these attributes as well. For example, the stroke itself right now has a kind of a thin appearance. Right now, the actual weight or the thickness of that stroke is set to 1 point. I could adjust that as I need by coming over here to the control panel and choosing maybe a heavier weight, maybe 10 point, or maybe something that's like, 50 point, a lot thicker that way. So you can basically decide how heavy you want that stroke weight to be. Let's leave it at 10 for now. And I also have the ability to choose from a variety of different fill attributes. For example, right now, this is filled with this solid yellow color. However, Illustrator also has the ability to fill objects with a pattern. And there are many ways to create patterns, and we'll explore that later on in the title. You can also fill things with gradients. And gradients are basically the ability to blend very cleanly from one color to another or with many different colors. This is another example of a gradient that starts with one color, blends into another color, and then blends back to a different color after that as well. And blends themselves can either be linear gradients, meaning they go in one direction and blend from one color to another, or gradients can have a radial setting, where I have a color that starts in the center and then radiates outwards. So there are different kinds of attributes, and again, throughout the title, we will go through all these particular settings. It's just important to realize that a regular path itself has these two attributes, a fill and a stroke attribute. So if I go ahead and let me go over to this particular circle right here. Again, right now the circle would be invisible when I print it. However, I could apply a stroke to it. Maybe we'll do a 10-point stroke, and that's set to black right now. But the stroke itself, besides having a different thickness applied to it or a weight, there are other settings you can apply to the stroke as well. For example, if I go ahead and I click on the word stroke here and I bring up the entire stroke panel, I have the ability to align that stroke towards the inside or the outside of that particular path, so I can control the appearance of where that paint gets applied. I could also turn on something called a dash line, and that will basically turn that stroke on and off at specific intervals. And I can go ahead and specify exactly using these dash and gap settings how long each of these particular dashes and their gaps should be. So for example, I can set this dash to be 24 point, but that the gap should only be around 6 points. So now I'll have basically a long dash and a short gap, a long dash and a short gap, so on and so forth. So within these particular attributes, a fill or a stroke, those fills and strokes can be manipulated to have many different kinds of appearances as well. And of course, as we go through the title, we'll learn all those. So basically now we know that vector graphics are made up of a variety of anchor points and control handles. We know that the paths that are created or defined by those anchor points and control handles can be basically set to have a stroke appearance and a fill appearance as well. And that allows me to control what my graphics look like. As we go through the title, we'll see how we can modify those to really build just about any kind of graphic that we want.